Okay, let's look at our week 2 materials. So this week we're going to be starting our unit on institutions by looking at the legislative branch of the federal government. And we're going to ask ourselves some big questions this week. First, how does the institutional structure of Congress affect the lawmaking process? And how does this in turn affect environmental policy? How do external factors like elections and other factors like political polarization affect lawmaking on the environment? And how much power does one congressperson actually have to get a law passed and do anything about environmental policy? So with those 3 questions in mind, let's turn to our materials. We start with a good overview of these various institutional and electoral concerns that may affect how laws get made in Congress. And specifically, we're going to look at how they affect environmental lawmaking. So we're going to look at the statutory setting. That is to say, how Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, was actually set up by the Constitution, what powers they have, and their structure. We're going to look at an internal structure, committees. So each chamber has a bunch of committees within the chamber that have a lot of power over the lawmaking process. So we're going to take a look at those. We're going to look at localism, which is a concern for Congress members because they have to represent a local place, right? They have to go home to their home district in the case of the House, their home state in the case of the Senate, and explain what they've done. So they want to pay attention to their local place and those concerns. Elections. That certainly ties into localism, right? They have to get reelected by this locality. But there's also just frequent elections, right? The House is up for reelection every 2 years. The Senate, there are elections every 2 years, but each senator is up for reelection every 6 years, and there's 3 cycles of elections. So those different dynamics change the dynamics of the lawmaking process. Also, crisis decision-making. That is to say, Congress is often reactive. A crisis happens and they have to address it. Guidance. We're going to look at both Congress's perhaps challenge with not having a lot of guidance themselves and maybe with not giving a lot of guidance, right? Because they're not the ones who are actually implementing the laws. That's the job of the executive branch who executes the laws. We'll talk about them next week. But we know that because Congress isn't executing the laws, they have to guide the people who are. So they have to make this guidance. And how effective are they in really doing that? Finally, we have partisan polarization as a concern and how this, again, affects the lawmaking process and how parties affect the lawmaking process. Now, the reading that highlights each of these points discusses primarily how they can hinder environmental policy making. But it's actually a really complicated story. So I've given you 2 videos, one on committees in Congress and the other on parties in Congress, that complicates the picture. It says that committees and parties, which are the root of polarization, may actually facilitate lawmaking, and highly polarized parties, insofar as conditional party government says that the more internally unified a party is, the more power they can have if they're in the majority. Parties actually might make lawmaking easier. Committees might make lawmaking easier. Now, these are theories, right? And maybe the picture in reality is more complicated, like the first reading suggests. But we want to consider all these different ideas. We also have another video that sort of complicates things, looking at polarization itself. Now, this video by Zachary Neal describes his own research and gives a nice illustration of polarization in Congress and explains how polarizations become us versus them, at least within Congress. Now, polarization is really an important factor in politics today, and I am doing my own research on polarization within Congress and how that affects lawmaking on environmental politics, specifically on climate change. Because it's specifically on climate change, I'm going to save most of this discussion for later this semester when we talk about climate change specifically. But for now, I'm going to give you a little preview of my data. And you'll see that if you pull up our summary document, you're going to see two lovely charts that show that in the late 70s, Congress really was not polarized on the issue of climate change. Republicans and Democrats voted very similarly. If you were to just look at the voting record of one member of Congress, it would be pretty much impossible to tell which party they were a member of by looking at how they voted on climate-related legislation. Some Democrats voted very anti-climate. Some Republicans voted very anti-climate. Some Democrats voted very pro-climate. Some Republicans voted very pro-climate. But most of both parties voted sort of in the middle, sometimes pro, sometimes anti. Now, this has changed. In the late 2010s, we see that you can almost always predict what party member is just by looking at their climate voting record. So if you see someone who has almost never voted on legislation that would help curb climate change, you know that they are probably Republican. If someone almost always votes yes on that kind of legislation, they are going to be a Democrat. And in fact, most people aren't voting in the middle at all. So it's not even just that we know now the parties are voting in different ways from each other, but the same ways as each other. There's no one in the middle. So it's not like, okay, Republicans and Democrats just don't vote the same. They're also voting more extreme. So we can see that they've moved apart and that middle has gone away. So that can make it sometimes really difficult to make laws, because if you have a small majority, if you don't have much of a majority, one or two members of your party disagreeing with you might actually be enough to tip things over to the other side. And because the other side really disagrees with you because of polarization, that's then enough to kill your bill, because you might not get a bipartisan majority anymore. That said, if you don't lose party members, if party members stay on board, then as long as you're in the majority, you're pretty much set because your party agrees on this issue. So we can see that polarization complicates things. It could potentially make things easier, but as that first reading suggests, it often makes it a lot harder. Now, finally, I give you an op-ed from the Washington Post that is going to illustrate how all these different factors and some other factors converged in 2010 to stop President Obama from pursuing his environmental policy agenda. And we're going to learn more about the president's role in environmental policy and politics next week as well. There's a second article that illustrates this, looking actually more recently at Biden's environmental agenda. That is an optional article, though. So you only have to look at the Stromberg one about Obama, but I do encourage you to check out this other example by Cochrane about Biden's policies. There's also an optional video about the lawmaking process in general. So if you've never taken an introductory American politics course, I really encourage you to go and watch that video. And even if you have taken an intro course, it can be helpful to go back and watch this video and refresh your memory. So we have some key takeaways for this week. Lawmaking is hard and it's complicated, and there are a lot of ways to stop a bill from being made. It's actually much easier to stop a bill from passing than it is to pass one. Congress is slow, and it tends to react rather than be proactive. The party in control of each chamber has a lot of power over what gets done in the chamber. Members of Congress are not experts in political science, and they have to consider a lot of things like what their constituents want when they're voting on bills about the environment. Lawmaking is a result of compromise and negotiation and a lot of political maneuvering. And all of this together can make it really hard to get good environmental policy passed.